The neighborhood was bad at that point.
By the early 70s, the Central West End was under siege.
Aging and poverty was a growing issue.
There was an idea that we could tear down many of the buildings.
It was young and old, and some rich folks were still here, plenty of poor folks, gay people, straight people.
Everybody who came to the area had that common ingredient of aspiration.
We all took care of one another. I think it was the neighborhood itself, the actual physical neighborhood that said, come here, come here.
The heroes are the visionaries who see what needs to be done, try to get things going.
We want this neighborhood not only to thrive in the moment, but to survive into the future.
If you believe in this city, and if you have a story to tell that is a compelling story, people will listen.
At the geographic center of the United States is the city of St. Louis. And in the center of St. Louis is a unique 6-square-mile area. The area is a showcase displaying St. Louis's rich historic past. And yet the majesty of yesterday blends with the influence of today in this unique area, known as the Central West End.
A Valentine to urban living. This cheerful promotional video from the 1970s pronounces the comeback of a once grand neighborhood fallen on hard times. But its sunny images of tree-lined streets, bustling commerce, and smiling neighbors do not convey the whole picture, because any happy ending to this tale was far from certain. This is a story of how, over a century, a neighborhood was born, grew, and thrived, staggered and was nearly abandoned, brought back from the brink, and given new life. It's the story of how a brave decision defied the trends of its day to set in motion a chain of events that would change a city. Since its founding, the history of St. Louis has been one of steady western expansion. In the late 1870s, the land just east of the newly created Forest Park was still mostly farmland and not an easy journey for most city dwellers. But the 1904 World's Fair made the park a popular destination, while public transportation and better roads made the western edge of the city easier to reach for St. Louisans attracted to cleaner air, newer dwellings, and open spaces. A new neighborhood was growing around Kings Highway.
At the time of the fair, there were just houses along Lindell and a few other blocks of adjacent streets. The real development occurred right after that. The new cathedral was started in 1907. St. Louis was pretty much reaching its heyday in terms of architectural talent right at the time that this neighborhood was being built. And to their credit, many of these institutions and individuals hired the best architects to do their buildings.
From its earliest days, the Central West End was a place of culture, home of novelist Kate Chopin, playwright Tennessee Williams, poet T.S. Eliot, and mentor to the Beat Generation, William Burroughs. The Chase Park Plaza was, for decades, the choice of celebrities and Hollywood stars, while Maryland Avenue was a center of elegant shopping. Through the 1950s and 60s, the nightlife of Gaslight Square attracted top entertainers from around the country. It was clear from the beginning that this neighborhood was to be something out of the ordinary. Even as the first mansions were being constructed along Lindell Boulevard, the west end of the city was attracting the attention of the Washington University School of Medicine. Robert S. Brookings, a charismatic, self-made businessman turned philanthropist, was the chairman of the university's Board of Trustees. In 1910, following a report by the Carnegie Foundation that blasted the competence and integrity of most American medical schools, including Washington universities, he fired most of its faculty and initiated a total reorganization of the school's medical education. Brookings wanted to move the school from its downtown facility, and as it turned out, his decision to rebuild it near Kings Highway would be influenced by the legacy of another prominent St. Louis businessman and philanthropist, Robert Barnes.
Robert Barnes died in 1892 without any children. So he left his fortune basically to an endowment to fund a hospital that eventually would be built. And the Barnes Trust bought the property here at the eastern edge of Forest Park. And then Robert Brookings bought property nearby for the medical school buildings. And so then they worked together, Barnes Hospital trustees and Washington University. They hired a single architect, Theodore Link, to design and build really a state-of-the-art, for the time, medical center.
It was surprising that they chose this particular location. It was on the very edge of town. And in fact, they were worried that patients would actually come all the way out here to go to the hospital.
Certainly a lot of the infrastructure here really helped bring the medical school here in the first place. I mean, Forest Park was, just a great amenity to have right next to a hospital and medical school. But also the streetcar system was also important. It kind of allowed them to move further west. And even though Brookings, when they dedicated the medical school buildings, he said that, we were much further west than we had been, but we're so well connected and we're building this wonderful facilities that people will still want to come here, even though we're now out at the far western boundaries of the city.
From day one, 1915, it was one of the best medical centers in the entire country. There was everything here. It had good facilities, good faculty. By any measure that you can think of, it was one of the top medical schools.
A medical school partnering with a hospital to provide practical learning for its students. More would follow. Children's Hospital, Jewish, Shriners, St. John's, Missouri Baptist, and others. In 1962, several of the major hospitals formed an organization that would make it easier to make collective decisions impacting their institutions and the surrounding neighborhood. The Washington University Medical Center and affiliated hospitals.
So what eventually came out of that was a plan to create a new position called the Vice Chancellor for Medical Affairs. And actually it was Carl Corey, Nobel Prize winner, who kind of came up with the suggestion. He had worked with a young physician who had worked in one of his labs, William Danforth, and thought that Danforth actually had a lot of those intangible skills that someone needed to be a great administrator. And so he put forward Danforth's name, and Danforth became the Vice Chancellor for Medical Affairs for Washington University and the President of the Washington University Medical Center and affiliated hospitals. So he really became a key player in building the consensus, creating an environment in which all these institutes of the medical center could talk with one another.
That was in 1969. No one then could have anticipated the consequences of their selection for the medical center and the surrounding neighborhood. In the years following World War II, a sense of uneasiness settled over the neighborhood as a combination of forces threatened the status quo. Neighbors formed groups to control prostitution and drugs, enforce housing codes, and keep the streets free of garbage and litter. But it seemed a losing battle. Patients and hospital staff were concerned about crime, and the medical center found itself at the edge of a neighborhood that residents, businesses, and major institutions were rapidly abandoning.
The city was transitioning toward a much higher proportion of African American population and a much higher proportion of poorer population. And the city had done some rather heavy-handed redevelopment in near downtown, and it pushed a lot of poor people out of there. They had moved out into other neighborhoods. That was a period when white people ran when they saw black people coming, sadly, but it's true. The greater force of that was happening to the north, north of Del Mar.
And in those days, there was blockbusting, there was redlining, there was all of the social ills and economic ills that we've tried to deal with since then. And government entities were not as conscientious about protecting people. You know, by the early 70s, the Central West End was under siege.
But I bought my home in 1970, same house I live in today. And back then, the guy representing the seller was a friend of my father's, and he tried to talk me out of buying the house. I paid under $14,000 for the house. And he said, you're gonna lose your money, don't buy here. And I went ahead and bought anyway, and it was a difficult neighborhood. I mean, the first 6 months or so that I lived there, I was burglarized 3 times. I mean, it was chancy.
There was a lot of petty crime going on, perhaps more than petty crime. It was a bit of a stroll as you walk past Maryland Plaza. I was propositioned more than once walking down, going home. It was a challenging environment back in that day.
There was a funny story on Westminster Place where somebody told me his bicycle had been stolen. I said, well, big deal. That's a sort of afternoon activity. And he said, yes, but they stole it from the room I was sitting in.
The area specifically near the medical center, it was declining very slowly. Race was not so much an issue. Aging and poverty was a growing issue. The percentage of households that were above 60 years old was very high for any neighborhood. So it was mostly white poverty, and people couldn't keep up their homes, couldn't pay the rents, and didn't know where they were going to go.
Along West Pine and Euclid, which were the 2 key blocks for the medical center, probably a third to half of the residential buildings on those blocks had become rooming houses or boarding houses. And the institutions of the medical center were very concerned about the impact on their existence and their prosperity.
There was good reason for that concern. The prior decade had seen an exodus of hospitals from the city to St. Louis County. Shriners Hospital moved in 1963. 3 years later, St. John's Mercy relocated to what some would refer to with grim humor as their palace on Ballas. St. Luke's to Chesterfield in 1974. St. Anthony's moved to South County, and Christian to North County. It was time for the Washington University Medical Center to make a decision with far-reaching impact on the future of the center, the neighborhood, and the city. To stay or to leave.
I thought we've got to decide what to do, whether we move or we don't move. So I I formed a committee, asked a group of the people to each of the institutions to send a couple of people to the committee, and we began studying the issue. And of course, there were some differences of opinion. I asked Dr. Ronald Evans, who was then a very young assistant professor, to staff the group because I'd gotten to know him and thought very highly of him.
And my first job, I was 30, just finishing my residency, was to be Bill Danforth's assistant. I had this great title, Associate Vice Chancellor for Medical Affairs. And essentially, I was the organizer of the strategic plan to decide what should we do in 1970.
Each institution had its own board, its own clientele, and its own vision of its role in the future of St. Louis medicine. And then there was the historic tug of the open spaces of the region's western boundaries.
First thing I wanted to do was say, why did people move? And so I got out a map and I saw where they were going and where they'd been. And I could tell that in the early part of the century, when the hospitals were built and established, that Kings Highway was sort of the outer belt then. It was to St. Louis what 270 was in the 1960s. And the hospitals located there, they were closer to their patients.
I would have said when this all started, if you had a vote on day one, hey, we would have moved out to the county. It seemed so easy. Buildings here were in bad shape. Why build here when we could build out at Plaza Frontenac when everybody can get to us? That was sort of the first reaction. I always thought that if there was any of the institutions in the city that should think about leaving this campus, it was Jewish Hospital.
By this time in the 1970s, the Jewish community that was so strong for Jewish Hospital, in the earlier days lived around Del Mar and in University City, they had moved out to the West County. Barnes Hospital and Jewish Hospital were really battlers. They were fighting for the same kinds of patients, and they were just a block apart.
Ray Witkoff was a St. Louis real estate developer, civic leader, and trustee of Jewish Hospital, who was firmly committed to remaining in the city. As the committee wrestled with its decision, he would play an important role in bridging the competition among the hospitals and focusing the debate on issues of mutual concern to all of the institutions.
There were real arguments. I would have said that at one time or another, it would have been flipping of a coin with regards to moving or staying here, but it was unrelated to Jewish versus Barnes versus Children's. It was individual thoughts with regards to what would have created success.
There emerged three possibilities: stay, leave, or shift patient care facilities to the county, but keep teaching and research in the city.
So we had several months of a strategic planning process. Lots of meetings, consultants for advice, trips to other medical centers. It ended up with a focus on everybody getting to this meeting in which we had three of us give debates, truly debates supporting the three different positions. And after that, there was a bit of discussion, and we had a vote. And the vote was a unanimous decision to stay here. To me, the critical issue that decided for us to stay here was essentially the medical school and research labs. While there was enough space out there to build hospitals, there really wasn't a lot of space. As you can see, this medical center around here is huge now. And a lot of it is research buildings. Building beds, that's easy. But building laboratories? What about the cyclotrons? What about those positron emission bits?
We were citizens of St. Louis. Our institutions had grown up in St. Louis, and we felt it would be bad for St. Louis if we all decamped to the county.
The decision had been made, but no one could have anticipated the chain of events that would follow, or the degrees of time and effort necessary to show that it was the right decision. So what next? What could the future hold for a major medical center committed to remaining in an economically depressed neighborhood while its competitors had already left for greener pastures? It became clear to the affiliated hospitals that if they were to survive, they would have to speak with a single voice and work more closely than ever toward a shared future. The strategy would be two-pronged: to modernize and expand the medical center and improve the surrounding neighborhood. The committee contacted the architectural firm of Helmuth, Obata, and Kassebaum to come up with some ideas. It was not the best of beginnings.
Ray Witkoff asked me to do a master plan of the whole medical center. And because that was quite a large project, we felt that the surrounding area ought to also be studied for housing and so forth for the people working in the medical center.
I don't want to be critical of HOK. It's a brilliant group, and Gio Obata is one of my most admired people. They spent some time and developed a plan, a visual plan, and it appeared on the front page of the Globe Democrat on a Sunday morning. I had not expected or anticipated, and neither had a lot of other people.
We did this plan without much research into the existing, fabric, and it was just sort of an idea of how to create housing area close to the medical center.
And it created a huge amount of concern in the neighborhood, because the picture showed not only a number of very large, beautiful buildings, but it showed none of the existing buildings that people were there to live in or have small shops. They had just been eliminated, and the people who lived and did business in those hadn't expected it, and they just went berserk when they saw it.
Well, that area was blighted in a sense, and therefore there was an idea that we could tear down many of the buildings and then put up a whole new high-rise apartments and townhouses. We probably should have done a lot more study before. There was a great deal of opposition by the people who lived there, and I don't blame them.
Conceptually, I think it was profound. It changed everybody's thinking because it brought a focus to the area. It suggested that there was something different that could be done, but it suggested what maybe shouldn't be done, which was almost a clean sweep of the neighborhood and a rebuilding from the ground up. That was the opportunity here, was to rethink that concept and say, let's figure out what is good and useful that we can keep, and then use those bones to build on.
We are not a suburban medical school, we're an urban medical school. And we have to be a part of the renovation of this area. We have to address the social ills that's part of what we're about as a medical school. We have to have this type of social responsibility, which would certainly benefit the community, but it would also benefit us.
Dick Roloff was the right person to start the process of engaging the medical center with the neighborhood. He worked for a real estate developer who served on the university's board of trustees, and he agreed to volunteer his time to help the university get a better feel for the area just beyond its campus.
I first decided I better learn more about the neighborhood and the people who live there. I spent a lot of time walking the streets of the Central West End. I was not knowledgeable about who was who and where they were. As I moved from block to block and met people and knocked on doors and found that there was a pretty interesting neighborhood, one that certainly deserved some care and attention.
So he came up with a more general plan that we ought to try and put together enough money to buy some of these houses and then help people redevelop them.
But these were doctors and hospital administrators, not real estate developers or politicians. If they were going to get anything done, they would need a lot of help. Political allies to help them negotiate the legal landscape of urban development, financial resources to prime the pump, and the trust of a neighborhood that had its share of suspicions when it came to the medical center's motives. As it turned out, the medical center found a valuable ally in an old-school city politician by the name of Joseph P. Rohde.
My dad happened to have been the political leader of that area. He wasn't the alderman at the time, he was circuit clerk. He controlled a lot of the patronage jobs in the city, which was kind of the center of the Democratic Party. So his role was very much kind of an intermediary, someone who, you know, the leaders of the medical center would come to and say, okay, this is what we're wanting to do. You know, how do we go about doing it? And of course, he would say, well, we just can't do it. We'd have to share that, and they would have neighborhood meetings and begin discussing the process. People just jump up and start yelling at the folks explaining what's going on. And of course, my dad would know the people on a first name basis and say, you know, calm down now, let's go ahead and, you know, we all have to kind of get through this and listen to each other. And, you know, just by creating the space to have those dialogues, an element of trust was developed, and eventually the legislation would get passed.
His only price was that we include in the redevelopment plan some of the area south of Highway 40. Time has proven him right. That is the area now popularly known as the Grove, and he had the vision to see this and insist on it.
In the spring of 1974, the Board of Aldermen passed legislation creating the Washington University Medical Center Redevelopment Corporation, granting certain powers to encourage development within a 280-acre area surrounding the medical center, including the power of eminent domain. To raise money, it sold bonds to members of Civic Progress and assessed contributing hospitals. The mechanism was in place to make changes. Now they needed a plan.
It was a group of 4 of us that graduated at about the same time at Washington University. We were in the urban design graduate program at the College of Architecture, along with one lawyer. He was receiving a master's in urban law. And we decided in the spring of '68 we would see if we could start our own firm. We bought the old police station on Newstead.
And people thought we were nuts. The neighborhood was bad at that point. And we saw an opportunity to buy this beautiful old building and put our stake in the city of St. Louis.
Team 4 represented a new generation of urban planners who had seen the failure of the big plans that involved tearing down swaths of cities to build futuristic complexes. They saw beyond what was wrong with the Central West End to focus on its strengths: architecture, history, and a core of caring residents.
It wasn't too long after we moved there that we got a visit from Dick Roloff. He was looking for someone to be his right hand, let's say, be his technical outreach to plan and execute a redevelopment plan for the area. He didn't come to us and say, this is what I want to do here. He was just interested in having someone to engage with him in thinking it out and then working with the community. We got plenty of people that did not believe what we were saying. They had to be shown that the university was really going to do what it said it would do. And the university had to prove itself, and they did. I thought that was one of the geniuses of the whole thing, is the university set up a process where they were not going to be the developer. They were going to be what we called the umbrella developer. They were going to facilitate other people to come in, take over the development of properties, or people who owned the property already to step up to the plate and do things that had to be done in order to keep the area vital and viable.
Washington University Medical Center Redevelopment Corporation, I've never counted the syllables, but that was really a mouthful. So it got shortened to WUMCROC. WUMCROC's a terrible name, but I became the first executive director of WUMCROC. The medical center was way too optimistic about how much it was going to cost. In fact, the schedule for the Redevelopment Corporation's existence was 3 years full out, 3 years sort of beginning to slow down, and then 3 years of kind of skeleton crew wrap it up. 40 years later, the Redevelopment Corporation still exists. Well, my job was to prepare sites, acquire property for the purpose of assemblage and resale for developers, institutions that might want to move into the neighborhood. We were visiting these places that we were interested in buying, and we would walk into buildings that at one time had been mansions, and we didn't know what we were going to find. In one case, one of our employees found a dead body. So the neighborhood was rough, but we could all see the potential.
Team 4 had developed a plan, and now it was time to act on it. Along the south side of Forest Park Boulevard was a large tract occupied by an odd collection of buildings. At the time, Blue Cross was considering moving its headquarters from downtown to the county. If WUMCROC could attract them to the Central West End, that would be a major accomplishment for an effort that badly needed one.
I joined the Redevelopment Corporation in early February of 1975, and I was handed the task of assembling the property for the Blue Cross building, which now is a building owned and occupied by Washington University Medical School. And Blue Cross had been promised that the property would be available by June. So 5 months we had to acquire 27 properties, do a massive amount of relocation, vacate an alley, vacate a portion of a street. We had to deal with the acquisition and demolition of a city fire station. And we had to do all of that in 5 months. We were a month late. We delivered the property in July.
Blue Cross was a learning experience and an important first step, but even more central to the mission was the development of affordable housing. The 4400 block of Euclid was just a few blocks east of the medical center and right around the corner from Team 4's offices. It was a good place to put the master plan into action.
On the Euclid was a group of about 40 houses, and they were in pretty bad shape. And the folks there kind of hanging on. They were having a hard time maintaining their homes, mostly older people. They didn't have a good exit strategy. So this is an opportunity to create a new private street.
The idea of making Euclid Place into a private street was that there was a growing sense that the residential areas around it were going to provide wonderful housing for the people who worked at the medical center.
Relocation was a fairly minor part of our whole endeavor because a lot of people had fled, including the rooming house population, that area, because it had deteriorated so badly.
People were given the opportunity to move into a new elderly housing that was built right there at the corner of Forest Park Boulevard and Newstead. And a lot of the people that were homeowners there did that. They got better than they otherwise would have gotten for their homes, and new people came in and rehabbed those units.
Well, I'm not sure we saw ourselves as urban pioneers as much as young people with families who were trying to find a comfortable place to live, and we liked the Central West End. And it was a grand neighborhood, and one that was affordable to somebody like me who was making $10,000 as an assistant professor of history.
The city provided 25-year tax abatements and made a number of improvements in the street's infrastructure, including a wide landscaped medium. The corporation bought the properties and turned them around to buyers who followed its guidelines.
That there would be certain standards, there would be no fences in the front of the properties, old fire escapes would come down from when these buildings had been rooming houses, and other kind of standards that we would all agree to follow. And I felt comfortable enough with that kind of structure to sink my limited resources into a house and to take on the task of rehabbing, which of course I'd never done, and if I had, I probably wouldn't have started it.
Euclid Place came back to life, attracting not just single professionals, as was expected, but young families as well. In its first year, Robert Wentz, the newly hired superintendent of schools, bought and rehabbed a house on the block.
And that was a big deal. Superintendent of schools making a commitment to move onto a block that was troubled at that time, and that vote of confidence was a real boost for us.
It very quickly turned out that when you provided a place like Euclid Place for young families to move into, they flocked there.
After years of hard decisions, false starts, master plans, deal-making, and physical labor, there finally were tangible signs of success. There was a sense of optimism, clearly evident in this promotional video, an atmosphere of let's roll up our sleeves and get the job done. But beyond the images here of urban prosperity, harmony, and hope was still a lot of work yet to be done.
The movement that occurred in the 70s really was kind of a false spring. We were really fighting against a strong wind there of anti-urbanism and the flight to the suburbs. If you look at the numbers for St. Louis and other older industrial cities like St. Louis, the 70s and largely the 80s were very tough decades.
And what was going on in the Central West End bucked that trend, a model based on community engagement. The medical center couldn't do it by itself. In fact, the plan never was to do it alone. And that was possible because the neighborhood had a core of active, creative people with innovative solutions to community problems. And for many of them, this redevelopment plan offered them encouragement to hold their own course.
The whole initiative of the university and its institutions to put capital into this area and to make clear to the rest of the world they weren't leaving. That was a catalyst for everybody and anything within 5 miles around, that there was something positive, something good, and something permanent that was going to be there.
The fabric of the neighborhood seemed to be constantly in need of repair. And that was what we felt we had an obligation and a responsibility to do, because it was of such genuine cultural and architectural significance.
Well, 4 of us just happened to be sitting in the backyard, and somebody said, well, why don't we start a newspaper? And it sounded like a good thing to do. And we finally figured that we could probably scare up $100 a piece to get it going. And then we would sell ads and pay for the printer. And we did that.
I remember in the first issue, I wrote this editorial, which was on the front page, that said, we're boosters. We want this neighborhood not only to thrive in the moment, but to survive into the future.
We hoped it would do exactly what it did do, which was that it was a vehicle for multiple voices. We reported very positive things along with things that were problematic, and we covered the activity of groups that were not covered in the major media. So we accomplished our goal from the get-go. We were a vehicle.
The neighborhood also had a core of young entrepreneurs, attracted by its gritty urban charm and low rents. When the clubs, restaurants, and antique shops closed down in Gaslight Square in the late 60s, some of that energy resettled around the intersection of Euclid and McPherson, several blocks north of the medical center.
This is 1972. Balaban's opened in April of 1972, and Duff's opened in July. So we were the pioneer restaurants. And what else was there? Next door was the witchcraft store with Debbie the Witch, real witch. Oh, and the Cabinet of Dr. Kilgari, which was a movie theater. Pete Rothschild was to the north of the witchcraft store. He was called then Ultra Alternate. His shop was called that.
And I knew for sure that the neighborhood was going to thrive. Loved the old architecture, and the mix of people was young and old, and some rich folks were still here, plenty of poor folks like me, gay people, straight people. It was a real mixing pot and very interesting.
So many different kinds of people from so many different places cross paths here. Everybody who came to the area had that, if you will, common ingredient of aspiration.
A really great synergy existed between especially Left Bank Books and Duff's Restaurant. That was, such a kindred spirit of a place for us. I felt like I wasn't going out to eat when I went over there to grab lunch. I was going over to Mom's house.
In our minds, it was a place that would be part of a neighborhood. We all took care of one another. It was a restaurant, of course, but it was way more than a restaurant. It was definitely a family. At the beginning, we made the mistake of having tabs. We'd let people have tabs, but then they couldn't pay their tabs sometimes. So, well, would you take this painting in exchange for my January tab? We'll go, sure. Would be happy to do that. And we enjoyed that in many ways, bartering. I think that's a good way to work.
Duff's offered local poets a place to read their work and musicians to play their music. Left Bank Books grew into a popular destination for authors on national book tours.
We shared a podium back and forth for years, and we, one or the other would always be walking across the street to drag the podium to the other place. It was so comfortable.
I give credit to all the little small businesses that moved into the Central West End, particularly in the 70s when it was a little risky, and said, I'm going to be a bookstore, I'm going to be a restaurant, I'm going to be an antique store. I think it was the neighborhood itself, the actual physical neighborhood, that said, come here, come here.
There was a ripple effect from the Washoe redevelopment, which caused a little more confidence in the ownership of homes and property, even north of Lindell. And we all felt that once we had others moving in who were associated with the medical center was a real positive thing.
Beyond their architectural significance, the churches of the Central West End have, from the earliest days, been an important part of the neighborhood's social fabric. When Second Presbyterian was built on the northeastern edge of the neighborhood in 1896, it was a place of worship for much of the city's elite. Its Romanesque sanctuary was designed by Theodore Link, the architect who created Union Station and the original West End medical buildings. In the early 1960s, the church faced a decision very similar to that of Washington University Medical School.
As the neighborhood was changing and members were moving away, some members of the church thought that they needed to relocate or establish a church where the people were moving.
In 1961, a vote was held in the congregation which numbered well over 1,000. The vote to stay was 511. The vote to leave was 500. After about a year, our congregation, to say it had been decimated, that's not even realistic. It had been cut in half.
And this wasn't part of the vote, but the discussions that surrounded this, if we're going to stay here, we need to do more to stabilize and enhance the livability and viability of the Central West End neighborhood.
We formed a Central West End, not an association, I'd call a mustard seed organization, saying if you have the faith of a grain of mustard seed, you can move mountains. And so we collaborated with Trinity Episcopal, with Unitarian Church, with Pilgrim Congregational, with Westminster Presbyterian, and those of us who had decided to stay tried to combine forces to make more of an impact on the needs of the community.
They decided that what they had to do was work on the community, not on filling pews in the churches so much as let's look at the big picture here.
Washington University stayed at the south end of the Central West End, and we were at the north boundary of the Central West End, and things happened in between us that each institution encouraged and sponsored, and eventually the neighborhood became a very desirable place to live. And I think that had the university left and that Barnes lost its connection with the medical school, I'm not sure that Second would have stayed here.
During the worst days of its economic decline, the neighborhood was also losing its educational anchors. The public schools were facing a number of challenges at the time, and many parents were looking for alternatives. Enter New City School.
In the late 1960s, two Catholic schools, City House and Barrett Hall, closed, and the residents in the Central West End said, we need an educational option. New City was founded in the basement of the First Unitarian Church in 1969, about 100 kids. It moved to the building in which it's now located, Waterman and Lake, which had been built in 1901 as Mary Institute in 1971. And by the time I arrived in 1981, we had about 245 kids. It was a place of joyful learning, a diverse setting where kids could grow and learn. The school was founded basically to stabilize the neighborhood. That was the intent of the founders. Schools are designed to educate kids, semicolon, however, comma, they should also be community building institutions. They're the hope we have for our children and their future. And without a school in a neighborhood, it's really questionable whether families are going to buy there. If they have children, it's questionable whether they're going to remain there. And what New City School did was say to everybody, you can live in the Central West End, there's going to be a wonderful school within walking distance. Schools are really about hope.
If any single structure represents the Central West End, it would be the Park Plaza, built by Sam Koppler in 1929. Towering over Maryland Plaza, its lights are visible at night from miles away.
My grandfather actually built the Park Plaza. We became an entertainment hub. Every major act that across the country played the Chase Club. My dad, who was very entrepreneurial, said, "Wait, as long as we have these acts coming in, why don't we open a television station, tape these acts that are coming and telecast it around the area?" That was the start of KPLR, which was in 1959.
The Chase was the place, the destination of movie stars, heads of state, and locals seeking a night of dining and dancing at the city's plushest restaurants and clubs. The place to see and be seen. But by the 1970s, the street's upscale shops like Saks, Montaldo's, and the Women's Exchange had moved to the county, and the hotel was suffering with the rest of the neighborhood. Ted's father, Harold Koppler, decided to undertake his own redevelopment plan.
He decided that, gosh, the hotel is such an important entity for the city that, we should come up with a plan for Maryland Plaza. And so Mayor Cervantes and my father came together and came up with a plan, not only for the hotels, but for the street as well. Turned out to be okay.
But okay wasn't going to solve the problem. In 1981, Koppler sold the hotel, and development along Maryland Plaza continued to limp along. The Chase, the oldest part of the hotel complex, closed in 1989 and remained shuttered for a decade, an empty hole in the heart of the West End. It was time for a new plan.
We had a neighborhood concept that had to tie in to being a counterpart to what the hospitals were at the south end of Kings Highway.
And so the rising tide of redevelopment set the stage for a new plan. In 2004, Koppler Properties, working with the city and the Central West End Association, announced a series of improvements that would finally succeed in bringing residents, businesses, restaurants, and entertainment venues back to the street that had always been the symbol of the neighborhood's prosperity. Just west of Maryland Plaza were the grand private streets of Westmoreland, Portland, and Kingsbury Places, and Washington Terrace. But just beyond their gates, several blocks along Waterman and Pershing had fallen into a state of disrepair that to many seemed beyond rehabilitation. Among the neighborhood's problems, prostitution, burglary, and violent crime, extortion of businesses, and even sniping. Bringing this neighborhood back to life was the work of Pantheon Corporation and its founder Leon Strauss. His many projects included the restoration of the Fox Theater at Grand Center. It took a gut rehab of the entire neighborhood, a massive project, and not without controversy. But by the mid-'80s, more than 1,300 housing units and a business strip had been rehabbed. And though separate from the medical center's redevelopment plans, it fit the larger critical objective of stabilizing the city's central corridor. In all of St. Louis, there is no place more universally loved and shared than Forest Park. It was the park that first attracted the medical school and the hospitals over a century ago, and provided green space along the edge of a growing neighborhood. But as the city's population shrank, there were fewer resources to maintain the park, and by the 1980s, it was showing obvious signs of neglect. In 1986, a group of neighbors decided to do something about it.
Back to the beginning of Forest Park forever, it started around a kitchen table of people who lived in the Central West End, who loved the park, and who had seen just this slow deterioration over the years, and who really felt they needed to do something, that it had to get better. I mean, there was no question about whether or not. It was a matter of how to do it.
Region-wide consensus was essential. The park belonged to everyone. So after 2 years of gathering input from government, private and nonprofit institutions, neighborhood groups, and individuals, a master plan was presented in 1995. It called for $100 million worth of improvements, half from the city and half raised by Forest Park Forever.
If you believe in this city, and if you have a story to tell that is a compelling story, people will listen. The story that we had to tell was a simple story, and it was the story of a park that was the lifeblood of this community, and we needed it, and it needed us.
The decision for the university and its associated hospitals to stay put rested on the faith that the neighborhood could be saved. The original plan called for 9 years of investment. More than 40 years later, the mission continues and has expanded far beyond its original intent. In 1996, Barnes and Jewish hospitals merged. Today, it is the largest private employer in Greater St. Louis, the largest hospital in the state, and one of the top-rated hospitals in the nation, a leader in research and patient care.
We've grown together. The neighborhood has grown, we've grown, and now you just look around and it's just amazing what we've become. Not only have we remained in the city, but if you look at our campus today, it's growing. People are coming to us in increasing numbers. We're able to attract faculty and students from all over the world. Patients are coming to us in increasing numbers. And so it's just a wonderful success story for St. Louis.
The people who come to Washington University School of Medicine are the ones who come here because it's in the city. These are people who really do believe that our best days are ahead of us. The cities are going to be places for spontaneity, great ideas, creativity. I think our position, our place in the Central West End is one of the reasons we are such a remarkable institution.
For 20 years, development had progressed at a slow simmer. By the 1990s, it had broken into a boil, as evidenced by its ever-changing skyline. Today, the medical center is in the midst of a billion-dollar campus renewal project that is transforming the hospitals and School of Medicine far beyond the expectations of the original redevelopment plan. With rising property values and an influx of new residents, many from the medical center, developers are now eager to invest in the neighborhood. Critical mass has been achieved.
The Central West End in St. Louis is exemplary of the kind of re-urbanization that is occurring across the country. The fact that people are coming back to cities, the fact that millennials want to live increasingly in pedestrian-friendly, mixed-use, exciting, edgy neighborhoods, and the Central West End is that.
If you drive around the neighborhood and you look at it, you don't think you're in a redevelopment area. You don't perceive it as a place that was scraped and cleaned and rebuilt. It looks live, real. It doesn't look like it popped off of some architect's drawing board, the whole thing. It looks like it's been there and that the pieces fit together.
The revitalization of the Central West End introduced a new concept into the conversation about St. Louis's future. The idea of a central corridor, running from the Arch into the county, anchored by strong institutions, a backbone from which further development would extend into adjoining neighborhoods.
I really think that we're a catalyst for this growth of progressive thought, which brings in people who are looking for creativity, looking for innovation, looking for all these wonderful opportunities to share. And it's happening, and I drive around, I see it happening. I see it happening in Skinker to Bolivar, and I see it happening in the UC Loop. I see it happening in the Forest Park Southeast, in the Grove. And there's no reason why it can't happen going north of Del Mar.
Today, the lessons learned and the relationships established are being put to work on a 200-acre tract of land on the southern border of the Central West End. The Cortex Innovation Community is a district designed from the ground up to encourage entrepreneurial startups in bioscience, medicine, and technology. A collaboration among Washington University, the Medical Center, and other regional universities and learning centers, Cortex is the logical next step from the redevelopment of the Central West End, an urban innovation district attracting national attention and promising to take the region's economy into a new chapter.
Everybody's trying to redefine what St. Louis will become, but in and around the medical center, what you're really seeing is the future of St. Louis, with the Cortex Innovation community coming online and coming on like gangbusters, with a renewed interest in urban living, with a concentrated effort to maintain culturally, economically, and racial diversity within our neighborhoods. We're seeing a new St. Louis emerge right in front of us.
That is really a neighborhood we can all be proud of. It has diversity in every respect, diversity in terms of the offerings, the businesses, So it's really got a really good mix of what a city ought to be, and it really has been a big part of our ability to help make Cortex successful, but also to help with developing and making even stronger our central corridor of the city.
Success brings its own challenges. Can the neighborhood continue to offer affordable housing for a variety of income levels? Is there still a place for that exuberant funk of the old days? Will the redevelopment someday extend northward across the city's Del Mar Divide, as it has to other neighborhoods? Are there more leaders of vision and commitment to the community to follow those who began the work? The story isn't finished, but how could it be when there are no boundaries to the spirit of possibility?
We had an idea of what we needed to do, and we worked at it, and it worked out, at least so far. I would say we're not there yet, and I don't know where there is, but if people ever stop improving society, it'll go down the drain. The heroes are the visionaries who see what needs to be done and try to get things going. You can never stop.